Afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. My name is Travis Terry. I'm the president of Capalino and have the privilege of moderating today's very important Future of New York discussion on a complicated but important topic of procurement. As you know, our Future of New York series is an important component of Capalino's efforts to get important information and insights from very brilliant people, including Michelle, to help make you successful and help our city thrive. By the way, if you would like to watch previous episodes, we've covered a lot of interesting topics on everything from tourism to social services to green building, and it can all be found on our website at capalino.com. Procurement. So I'm sure many in the audience know, procurement is the process by which government purchases goods and services. It is a very long, complicated process. Usually takes about at least a year or so, and Michelle's smiling, and involves a city or state agency first identifying a need and a process for vendor selection that usually involves everything from vendor competence to cost to diversity through MWBE. It is a large marketplace. According to facts provided by the city and state, as well as their respective controllers, the city of New York spent approximately $30.4 billion in procuring various goods and services, and the state of New York spent about $24 billion through about 1,400 contracts. Here at Capalino, we spend a lot of our time working with both for-profit and not-for-profit clients to help them either deal with procurement issues or explore procurement opportunities in areas of everything from social services to real estate and goods purchases, technology especially. So joining me today are two incredibly smart people. I think you're going to learn a lot from them. First is one of the newest members of the Capalino family, Adam Buchanan. We're really excited to have him. Have learned a lot, or been very helpful to us and to our clients. Prior to joining Capalino, Adam served as acting deputy commissioner for citywide procurement for the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services, managing a portfolio of over $1 billion in goods and service contracts. So all those complaints in the past up until he joined us, you could all blame Adam for that. Just kidding. Michelle Jackson, who's a dear friend, is, in my opinion, a true unsung hero of New York, working as the executive director of the Human Services Council, which advocates for the nonprofit human services organizations that provide critical services for New Yorkers, such as seniors, youth, and the homeless and disabled. Human Services Council, I should say, is a tremendous organization. Everybody here should be supporting them in all the ways you can. And an organization that we have to thank for what is really important but incremental improvements to the procurement system, which of course is critical to their members because they carry out perhaps the most important services our government can provide through this incredible, vital public-private partnership. Before I start asking our guests many questions, just some quick housekeeping. Adam, Michelle, and I will probably spend about the first 45 minutes or so chatting about a variety of different matters. And then we're going to save some time towards the end for audience questions. If you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A section, and I'll be incorporating that throughout the conversation. So Adam, Michelle, thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And
very happy to be here, Travis.
Absolutely. And let's just jump right in. First question, can you describe the procurement process as it is today and kind of what your respective experiences are in being involved in it? Maybe Michelle, we'll start with you.
Sure. Small question. Whole procurement process. Well, first, I really want to thank you, Travis and Capalino, for having me today. And for people joining us, like, hello, fellow nerds. Right?
Yes. This isn't a story. This isn't a conversation around the Mets and all that excitement these days. So
exactly. But it's very exciting to the people who are living in it, because it's really how New York operates. And I think The experience of the human services sector is not different than other sectors. We have our own like nuances and headaches. But I think what I'll talk about certainly applies to the broader nonprofit sector. And also, when we've had conversations with real estate or architects, like a lot of different sectors have a lot of the same pain points and similar issues and process. So for human services in general, the human services sector in New York has about $6 billion in contracts with the city of New York. So it's a substantive business portfolio for the city. And I also think it's important to frame, like when we think about nonprofits and human services, like human services are really vital to the health and economy of New York. Everything from senior services to child services, but it's also child care, like how most people get to work. It's all the work supports of senior centers so that your aging parents can go somewhere for socialization or to get a hot meal. And we help keep New York safe and thriving. And so that $6 billion is well spent across the 5 boroughs. And for us, the procurement process, the experience isn't great. I think that might be a reoccurring theme for today.
Right.
But how the city puts out RFPs for human services, and that's the whole range of everything from youth services, emergency shelter, but also supportive housing, a real variety of programs. And they put out those RFPs in a pretty prescriptive way. They are pretty specific in terms of what they want the service to complete. So something that I think people understand is like, if you think of like an after school program, the city will say, what communities they need to be served. Is there a tutoring component, a sport component? Like they're pretty prescriptive in the deliverables, and also the rates, which I think is something that sets human services apart from other types of procurement. The typical like lowest bid model is like you say how much you pens, if you want 1 million pens, this is how much it'll cost you, and the city picks either the lowest bidder or the best bidder. And in human services, they really do put out like the rate per service, like how much an after school slot will be, or overall we expect you to serve 50 kids and here's how much it will cost. And so the city puts out an RFP with usually a pretty quick turnaround. Nonprofits in the community bid, new nonprofits who don't do those services who want to compete, but also of course the standard bearers who already have those contracts. And then it can take it takes a long time for an RFP to come out. The RFP is open for a very short window, and then there's a substantive amount of time that passes before providers are notified of awards, and longer before those contracts are registered, which I know we'll get into in much bigger detail as we go through this. So that's, those are the basic steps.
Got it. Thank you, Michelle. That's incredibly helpful. Adam.
Yeah, so, again, very happy to have Michelle here because I don't have a whole lot of experience in the human services realm, but from where I came from, procuring a lot of goods, a lot of standard services, some professional services and construction. On a very basic level, the city identifies a need, and then it goes through what, the industry refers to as a pre-solicitation review. That's where funding streams are taken care of and procurement method oversight, basically from the Mayor's Office of Contracts and the various procurement oversight entities within each agency. You decide what type of procurement method will be used. Obviously, you have your basic bids and proposals, and then there are the more complex procurement methods, negotiated acquisition, sole source, and then it goes out onto the street. That's what we call the solicitation phase. You have vendors submitting bids or submitting proposals, talking to the agency, going through Q&A, all that good stuff. And then you get to the award phase. After that, there's potentially a contract negotiation. And I'm sure we're going to touch a lot on that piece. Bids are, once you submit a bid, you're technically locked into all the terms and conditions that are contained in the solicitation. Whereas with an RFP or some of the other procurement methods, you have potentially some opportunities to negotiate the contract. Then you have a background check where the city is going to look at what's called vendor responsibility. That is basically, are you a good corporate citizen and are you a good individual citizen? And are you somebody the city is wanting to do business with? And then you have registration, which is the controller, the New York City controller registers all contracts in the city of New York. That's another layer of oversight. All that to say, it is an incredibly lengthy and complex process. I think we're here to hopefully help people have a better understanding of what they need to do in order to get into the government market in New York City. Because as Travis mentioned, there's a lot of money out there, and the city of New York needs a lot of help from the vendor and contractor community in order to provide services and goods to the citizens. So, really looking forward to jumping into some of the specifics.
Yep. Yeah, some really good points and background. Thank you both. What are, we have a lot of people listening who are either bidding on contracts or thinking about bidding on contracts, trying to understand the system. What are some of the pitfalls to be avoided?
Sure. Yeah, and I can get into, again, some of the basics, and I, would be really obviously curious to hear Michelle's take on some of the things that she sees a lot in the human services realm. So, when you're getting ready to propose or bid on a city contract, you really want to have your house in order. You don't want to have any unpaid taxes. You don't want to have any liens that have been unsatisfied. The city's going to look for violations, OSHA violations, all sorts of things like that. Once you actually do get into the contracting phase, pitfalls to be avoided, and I'm sure Michelle's got a lot to say about this too. But working at risk can be problematic for a lot of vendors. You're carrying a lot of costs, and your invoices may not be paid up to 30, 60, and 60 days. Even it can be even longer than that. And then the biggest one that I always like to talk to contractors and vendors about is you really got to understand the procurement documents. And if something doesn't make sense to you, it's very likely that it doesn't make sense to somebody else as well. And that's where the kind of pre-procurement piece of it comes in. You want to be asking questions. You want to be attending pre-bid conferences. You want to be attending pre-proposal conferences. You want to be submitting everything in writing and making sure that you're getting responses. You need to be a squeaky wheel here, because again, by the time it comes down to the bid due date or the proposal due date, it's too late. In a lot of instances, the city's not going to be willing to negotiate terms and conditions with you, or specifications that have been unclear or may have inadvertently provided a competitive advantage to one of your competitors. So, the biggest pitfall to me is vendors and contractors not having enough of an understanding, and who could blame them? These things are 900 pages long. It's just something that you need to have laser focus on in the beginning of the process, because by the time you realize that something's going to be problematic for you, it can be too late. And so again, everything ahead as far in advance as possible is really one of the keys. And that's a big pitfall that I see a lot of vendors get themselves into.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Michelle, let me bring you in here too. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one is that time is really amorphous to the city.
Right.
And so providers have a really short window of time to bid, and the city makes determinations pretty late in the game, at least when it comes to human services. And I think that's another area where the nonprofit experience is different, is, we have programs that either continuously operate. So if you already have a homeless services contract and you're bidding on a new one, you can't wait to find out that you're awarded. You can't close the shelter down and wait for, to win the next award. Whereas if you win an award for, let's say, something like after school programs, you have to start the program when school starts. So even if you're a new bidder, you can have the same problem. Whereas if you're a construction, and obviously there's, nuances here too, but if you're a construction bidder, you can say, I'm not building the bridge until the contract's registered. So timing on RFPs is, I think, a big concern, not just to know when you're awarded, but as we all know, it's been, pretty well reported. If you're joining this webinar, you know this, that the contracts are, and I think the Adams administration has made real leaps and bounds to kind of clean up the backlog, but providers wait up to a year to get paid. And they often operate without a registered contract, with just the registration part, which, as a lawyer, you're like, what? Don't do that. But the option is shutting down your programs until you wait for those registered contracts. So there's some real risks just in participating in the process. And so You can't avoid those in human services. So it's mostly just how do you mitigate those, knowing that your contract might not be registered in time. I would highly recommend people not starting the program if possible until those contracts are registered. And then also realizing that you're going to be floating the city for a number of months. And hopefully that will become less and less under the Adams administration, because I think they're doing the right things to improve the process. But that's certainly like the, the piece that you're coming into. And then besides the backlog, I think, looking at when you look at the RFPs, paying attention to the metrics, especially in social services, a lot of those metrics are not based on any kind of science. Like the idea of like 90 days out of shelter, there's actually no national data that says that that's the right amount of time. So paying attention to what you're signing up for and knowing how you're supposed to meet those metrics.
It really is. I always find executive directors of nonprofits to be most incredible leaders, given the amount of stuff they do in the course of a day. I mean, I know we were always constantly like celebrating CEOs and business leaders, and many of them should be, but the advocacy, the operational side, the finance side, running an organization when you're not 100% sure, and trying to do good social programs that impact people on a daily basis, well, not knowing for sure whether or not you actually have the money to support it. It's incredibly courageous.
Yeah.
It's just remarkable to me what there should be. I mean, Forbes should be working and talking to nonprofit leaders. Like, if you really want to learn how to run an operation, those are the folks that should be highlighted. You both touched a little bit on it, but are there other best practices you would suggest for people sort of exploring these opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to best practices for the nonprofit sector, one is knowing your own true costs. I think a lot of nonprofits have been in the business so long of like trying to make it work. To Travis, your point, I always, whenever you hear the like nonprofits should operate more like a business, I'm like, then they wouldn't do business with the city, right?
Right, absolutely.
And so a lot of providers, they don't really know like how much a unit of service really costs them. They know what they bid on and they know what they report on their paperwork, and then they supplement that with private, dollars and philanthropy. But like knowing your true costs, like how much does a unit of service really cost your organization, can help you be better prepared to at least know what the gap is going to be when you take on these contracts. And also knowing that you're not going to get a cost escalator on nonprofit and the human services. So if you sign a contract for 5 years plus, an attempt to renew for another 2, that's 7 years of mostly stagnant costs. And so at least knowing those things are ways to kind of create your own best practices about like true costs. How are you fundraising? I think those are some of the big things that nonprofits really need to consider. And I think they would do a better job of including not applying for certain RFPs if they saw the differential between what it really costs for them to do the work and what the city was offering.
Right. Yeah, it's something that comes up a lot with our nonprofits is even though they're getting city contracts, they're only getting about 90%, 90 cents on the dollar. So they have to make up that other 10 cents, which through fundraising and other complicated, but unfortunately you have foundations and others that step into that gap. But I could imagine that that's just another stressor for the operation of some of these.
Yeah, I mean, that advice applies to the for-profit industry as well, because again, you got to really make sure you understand the language that's in the contract, particularly when it comes to price increases and contract modifications. And the city has typically, we will not, the city will not entertain a price increase request within the first year of the contract, and then on an annual basis thereafter. So you really have to do a careful job of estimating a year out, 2 years out, and there are all sorts of parameters that go along with that. So understanding what you're getting yourself into from the get-go is incredibly important. I would circle back to another thing that we talked about a little bit earlier, which is, again, it's like minimum qualifications, which are included in a lot of procurements, are incredibly important to pay close attention to, because you could put a lot of time and effort and money into crafting the perfect proposal, and you've got the best product and you've got the best service to offer and you got the best price and you're all ready to go, and you missed some silly, the vendor must have X years of experience on, projects of similar size and scope. And if you had just paid a little closer attention to that during the pre-solicitation phase, you could have asked questions. Well, why is the city setting the minimum qualification here? Potentially, maybe you could look at setting it here, and that would create more competition and would ultimately result in a better deal for the city. But if you miss that, you submit a great proposal, and the city is going to go through what's called a responsiveness check.
Mm-hmm.
And what the responsiveness check is, did the vendor check all the boxes that they were supposed to check? This is separate and apart from responsibility, which is, you're being a good citizen. This is, did you meet the minimum qualifications? Did you submit all the right forms? Did you obviously submit it on time and in the format that we asked, that the city asked for? So, the devil is really in the details when it comes to that, and you got to make sure that you have a really good understanding of what exactly the city is looking for, so you don't get knocked out before they even look at the substance of your bid or your proposal.
Yeah, reading comprehension is an important skill to learn, no matter where you are and what you're trying to do. Sure. So let me ask, why is it worth it to work with city and state government? What's sort of waiting on the other side of red tape, and I'm also just curious if you can maybe touch upon. It sounds like you need such an incredible operation to get a response to an RFP, right? And that clearly favors large businesses, large nonprofits who have that operation structure in place. Being fair to smaller businesses and smaller nonprofits who probably don't have the capacity, but still are doing wonderful work or have wonderful products and services that could be helpful to the city. Sorry, it's sort of a broad, probably 3 questions in there out of one, but just curious, Adam and Michelle, your sort of take on all that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's waiting on the other side is more red tape.
Right.
Winning the bid is like the least of your problems.
Right.
But I mean, I think first, why work with the city? I mean, there's a reason I'm not a direct service provider and I represent and fight on their behalf. Is because similar, Travis, to what you said earlier, they're really heroic in the way that they are able to make this work. I mean, I think for the nonprofit sector, it is worth it because that's a ton of money that goes into really important community programs. And when you look at the infrastructure of other states that don't invest in human services this way, there's certainly, real impacts on communities and businesses that don't invest that way. So I think from the nonprofit perspective, why is it worth it is because we're tackling the biggest social problems that are impacting New York. And showing up for, like the asylum seekers, it's nonprofits who are greeting them off the buses. It's all community services that will help those asylum seekers make their way to New York and other places like that they were supposed to go or thought they were going. And I do have to say, I think to your second point, Travis, that I think the system is not designed for competition anymore in human services. All of the issues that HSC tackles, and we really represent what we would consider larger organizations who contract with government at the city or state level, and all of the problems that plague them: not getting paid on time, not having living wages, not getting the full unit of service. That is a hindrance for larger organizations, and it keeps smaller organizations out. When you have an RFP for a very complicated service that's open for 6 weeks, you're not getting new bidders. And so I think that there has to be real systemic changes in order to have a real competitive process, again, in human services. I think there should also be other changes in how we do that procurement. But, I think that that's a big thing, is like the issues that we're talking about today are also what keeps smaller vendors from competing. When you float the city for 6 months, when you're not going to get paid on time, when you're going to have deliverables change halfway through the year, when you're not going to get cost escalators. I mean, that's what really keeps smaller CBOs from entering the system.
Yeah, and I agree with all that, and I know we're being critical of the system, and I think a lot of the criticism is warranted. But on the flip side, I think we all love New York City. We all think it's one of, if not the greatest city in the world. And if you can get a toehold in New York City, you can work in any municipality, certainly in the country, and maybe the world. I mean, I'll never forget. So DCAS, Department of Citywide Administrative Services, where I came from, during the pandemic, was responsible for purchasing all of the PPE and ventilators for the city. And it got to the point where I was just looking for vendors who had successfully delivered for other municipalities. So, and to me, the time crunch and the emergency nature of the situation was such that if I could just get on the phone with somebody from another municipality who worked successfully with this vendor, that was almost like that was good for me. It was almost like, okay, let's start moving them along into the contracting phase and start looking at the next person as well. So if you can do business successfully with New York City, I think you can work anywhere. So, you know, it is quite the process. There is a ton of red tape, pre and post contract, but if you can get yourself established in New York City, I think you can work anywhere. And you'll see, even as you're filling out questions, a lot of the background questions talk about your past work with other municipalities and other states, and other states and other municipalities talk a lot about that as well when they're doing their background checks of vendors. So if you do a good job for New York City, it's gonna pay dividends, not only with New York City. And you know what Michelle talked about is 100% true. Incumbents win a ton of contracts with the city. So again, but on the positive side of that, if you can become an incumbent, you are ahead of the game. If it's a continuing program for the city, or if it's a good that the city needs to continue purchasing on a long-term basis. And at the end of the day, New York City is not that different from a lot of these other municipalities. They have a lot of the same needs. And so again, if you can make it in New York, as they, you know, not to be too cliche, but if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. That's 100% true. That's 100% true when it comes to, you know, government contracting, for sure.
Well, and I think it's, you both make important points. And I think that it's also, you know, there's a purpose behind procurement, right? And it's meant to protect the public and make proper and appropriate decisions. And so often, you know, if there's one bad apple in a bunch, you'll see a whole bunch of New York Post articles and everyone's bad and all this stuff. But meanwhile, I mean, Michelle, you said it, they're procuring $6 billion a year in human services contracts. So if there's one bad apple that might be misspending, whatever it is, a couple $100,000, and that becomes a thing, we're forgetting the fact that there's, you know, 5.9 something billion dollars that's all been properly provided out. And I think that to me is a credit to public servants and to government when they, when they are actively trying to do things to help people and do it appropriately. And there's, 99% of the time it's being done that way. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes. Quick question. The city focuses on price per technical point, but what are the, Michelle, this is probably for you, but what are the limitations of this approach when procuring human services?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think of like the lowest bid or technical point model, it's, that's for pens, not people, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what the problem is. I mean, I think we should have a competitive process. We need to. We need to be holding vendors accountable. We need to be expanding the pool and changing the pool all the time. I mean, of course, you're always going to have organizations who are, to their credit, doing a good job and need to retain. But I think it's important for the public interest to constantly review and challenge vendors to compete and to show their work. And I think that the kind of competitive model doesn't fit for human services. It's a little bit of like a square peg.
Right.
Communities have different needs, even within New York City. And it's very nuanced in how we handle people who have, it's not just kids in after school, it's those kids have some trauma. And depending on, like the community that they live in or just from person to person. And so we don't involve, I think the real limitation to this approach is that having a competitive system actually locks out the community that's being served from contributing to what their community needs are, right? Like, so the actual end users who are the people who are experiencing those programs, they don't pay for the services. So they're not able to talk with their dollars. And then they're also not able, the city and state do not involve those community end users in how are those programs working? They also don't even involve vendors, by the way. Like when they redo an RFP, they don't say, how's that program working? Like what outcomes did you find that we weren't tracking, which can be a really good thing to help build a better program. Or, where were you supplementing money and where were you not spending money? Because that's the other thing, is that there's some clawbacks that happen. So I think that's the limitation to the approach, is that it locks out both the vendors and from communities from providing really vital feedback to improve those programs going forward. And it also negates the nuance that's required when you're talking about complex human needs in complicated communities. I mean, New York City, like we don't have to think about, poverty versus, more affluent areas, but it's also like access to transportation, food deserts. Right. Like there's a lot of things, like you just think about, places that are less accessible to the subway have a little bit of a different need, no matter how affluent, than, groups who are being served in Chelsea or somewhere where there's, 8 subway lines. So that, that can often be lost in kind of this broad competitive approach to human services.
Right. That all makes sense. By the way, just for our audience too, just a friendly reminder, if you do have questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A now. As we get, closer to 1:45, we'll start sort of weaving in some of those questions. Usually not a shy audience on these things. Technology has changed a lot of things. And there's a lot of sort of interesting innovations. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If I could wave a magic wand or snap your fingers and make an app or a tool that improves the procurement process, like, are we doing enough? What would it do? How would it make our lives better, or increase competition, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I would love to see information aggregated in one place where it could be reviewed by the community in an easy and digestible way. Right now, there's no way for anyone to go on a citywide basis and download all the bid and proposal results for, however long you want to go back. So you're not getting a sense of who's bidding and who's proposing. You're not getting a sense of who you could partner with. This information is available. It's just available on a very ad hoc basis. It's not easy to access contracts. So you can take a look at, past contracts and what other vendors have been able to negotiate or not negotiate, see how procurements for the same thing or the same service have changed over time. Being able to review that information easily without having to file freedom of information law requests or sort through 50 different agencies' websites on a daily basis would be, I think, incredibly valuable to the community in strengthening their responses to solicitations. It would be incredibly helpful, particularly in the MWBE community, because the only piece of information that's easily accessible is who won. And presumably, if you're an MWBE and you don't have a relationship with the company that won probably already has relationships with MWBEs that it's going to continue, and it's going to continue to reuse those relationships for the entire length of the contract. So you want to see who came in second and third and fourth, and maybe talk to those companies and maybe see how you could provide your services and your expertise. And maybe the next time the contract becomes available, you could win it. You could win it with them on a subcontractor basis, or you could win it with them on a joint venturing basis. I'm sure this is applicable to the human services realm as well. I mean, this information, it would be, not only is it good governance, it's not only is it good transparency, it's good for transparency, but it's good for the business community and the nonprofit community as well. Being able to see all this information in one place and have it be easily digestible, I think would be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, and I would concur. I mean, first, I'm going to say something nice.
You're allowed to do that on these.
News alert. The city did a really great job with what was called HHS Accelerator, which was an online procurement system. And I say was because it's transferred to Passport. So it was an online procurement system that was really for human services contract. And it really revolutionized procurement overall in New York City because it took the whole system online. There was a document vault. so you could store all your documents instead of providers, competing for 20 contracts and giving their board information and IRS information like 30 times, literally 30 times. They would put it all in one place. So save trees, save the environment, and really streamline the process, and allowed the city to kind of pre-approve vendors for competition. So you were worrying about the scope of work and can you do this program, not like, do I have my updated 990 forms? And that has really translated now into Passport, which is for all types of contracting, and ideally will be a lot, and Adam knows this, like ideally it needs to get there, but hopefully it will be kind of, to use Monsignor Kevin Sullivan's, like it's a pizza tracker, right? Where you can like see where your contract is and therefore also like see where the pain points are. And the Adams administration has released some of the data around it, which, helps our advocacy, but also lets you see some of in the aggregate where things are going. So I think they're on the right track, and we'd like to see Passport and, go to the next steps, which they're planning, which is really having a lot of more public transparency and for you to be able to see where things are. And so I think that's really great. And that is kind of what I would always suggest. And I think to Adam's point, I do think knowing who's bidding and who the winners and losers are is important. I think especially in human services, when we do think about some of the scandals in the human services sector, it's often because qualified bidders are not bidding on those contracts, right? I think especially when we think about what's happening in homeless services and has happened forever, is a lot of qualified vendors are like, that program isn't going to work, or it would lose a lot of money on that. And so when you see qualified providers not bidding on a contract, that is to me one of the first red flags of like what happens next. And if the city or the state or government in general is not saying like, most qualified bidders are not bidding on this, or I'm only getting 1 or 2 bids when this is, should be a bigger deal. Why not? And it's not because providers didn't get it in on time. It's because there's something wrong with the contract. And I think the public should be made aware of that. To see like no one bid, and then what were the next steps to fix the contract, not just do a negotiated acquisition or something like that, where now suddenly a group that was a $2 million group is $300 million in, emergency shelter contracts. And so, why did that happen? So I think that transparency piece, because a lot of our qualified vendors, do back away from certain types of work. And there's definitely a public awareness that should be made around that.
And just to pick up on what Michelle's saying, again, I can't stress how important it is for vendors to make themselves involved early on in the process. Because if there is a problem with the contract, not bidding, obviously, a company or a nonprofit's not going to bid if they see some kind of fatal flaw in the contract. But what the city really wants, and I can say this with all sincerity because I used to say it all the time, in the office and to any vendor who would listen to me, was we want the feedback. The city wants the feedback from the market. And the city wants the feedback from the market before it gets into the contract. So if the program has a fatal flaw, it would be great to hear from the vendors who don't intend to submit a proposal or a bid, why they don't intend to submit a proposal on a bid, and potentially what could be changed about it that would entice you to submit a bid or proposal. And obviously the city has to go through a process, and it can't be that, vendors are suggesting things that would make it more favorable to them. But if a vendor can make an argument that if you make a change, if you make this change, then, it's going to have broader market appeal and you're going to get better competition, that's something the city is absolutely interested in doing. And so, again, I would just urge, anybody who's listening, if you have issues with the procurement, let the city know, and hopefully they'll make the changes that will allow you to submit a bid or proposal and allow you to have success with the city.
Yeah, and I would just add there that Adam, I think you're right. And I think that's another change that would be nice, is to see the comments. One is the city should be releasing concept papers before they release an RFP. And for both an RFP and a concept paper, which is the kind of the pre-step of an RFP, they should publish the comments. Because I think that would also help. Like, what is the community suggesting to the city, and how have they taken that on? Because I think, like I said, Travis, you said this better, but 99.9% of vendors are doing a really great job. And the 1% of scandals, or 0.1% of scandals, are what make the news. And so the more that the city is transparent about the feedback that they're getting and how they're progressing in the process, it's better for the public to be able to see kind of where are those mistakes being made.
And I just want to clarify something too. If there's clearly, if the city or the state or any government goes through a process and has a sort of pre-RFP process, there's probably an opportunity to weigh in on what that could look like. But let's say the RFP is issued and there's some fatal flaws. Can you just describe what someone might be able to do in that case?
So yeah, it's you got the pre-solicitation phase, and it's obviously a lot easier to change things before it's written and out on the street. But there is, again, the vast majority of bids and proposals, RFBs and RFPs that are out there have a Q&A period. They have a pre-bid and a pre-proposal meeting where the solicitation's out on the street, and the city is soliciting feedback from the vendor community. And sometimes those meetings are, they tend to be optional. And so I think a lot of people see optional and they feel like that they shouldn't go, or that they're not required to go. But, again, I would urge anybody out there who's wanting to do business with the city and is looking at a solicitation, even if the pre-bid or pre-proposal conference is optional, you got to go, you got to ask your questions, get your questions in writing. And the city, again, I can speak from personal experience here. Any question that the city gets on a solicitation that's on the street, as long as they're getting it ahead of the Q&A deadline, they will publish an addendum to that solicitation answering the question. They'll print the question, they'll print the city's answer, and a lot of times, if the point is a good one, they'll make changes through that addendum to the solicitation. So the only time it's too late to shape the solicitation is after the Q&A period has passed.
Adam, there's a quick question in here that I just want to read. It just came through. It sort of picks up on that comment. How long can a vendor wait after the release of an RFP before raising the issue? And what is the process for complaining about RFPs restrictions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, once the RFP is on the street, you could start submitting your questions, and you just got to pay attention to the question and answer deadline. Sometimes agencies will have a time period within which they want feedback from the vendor community. Typically, the best time to get your questions in is right before the pre-bid or right before the pre-proposal conference. So you can maybe just get your question answered right then and there. The city will typically also, even if something gets answered orally during a pre-proposal conference, they'll still publish a written Q&A response. But typically the best time to get it in there is right after it hits the street, right after you recognize that there are some issues with it.
So don't miss the pre-bid conference. That's important.
Don't miss the pre-bid conference for sure.
If there's no takeaway from today, that's it. I want to turn our attention and get your take on the MWBE process. We at Capalino have certainly been we have an MWBE practice. We've been very active in advocating that the importance of MWBE participation in a lot of these contracts. What else can we be doing to make sure that MWBEs are both involved and supporting their efforts, especially in what is, many times it's a lot of small businesses, and a procurement process, makes you want to pull your hair out. What more could we be doing to ensure that participation?
I mean, my answer is pretty short because most human service providers don't qualify as MWBEs,
Right.
But they are required to follow MWBE practices. So to the extent that they have vendors, they are required to follow the MWBE requirements. And I think expanding the pool and having the city kind of publish, continue to publish and expand the list of MWBE vendors is crucial. And I think the nonprofit sector is certainly committed to using MWBE vendors. But, a lot of the work that they do on their contracts is program related, right? So they don't have, most of their contract is spent internally and not on outside vendors, but are certainly participants in that process. And, to the extent it could be extended to include nonprofits who are often led by people of color and women, or are serving those populations, or their board is made up of them, I think that would be great.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think the city does a lot of great work in the MWBE sphere, and obviously a lot more work is still needed. As I hope the MWBE community is aware, the threshold is for discretionary award purchases is going up from $500,000 to $1 million, which is a lot of money. And so, again, it's doing all the things that we've talked about today. It's making connections. It's getting yourself known to the agencies, and it's establishing, and establishing a good track record of success. And the city needs to do more outreach, and they need to do more capacity building. And Michelle knows this as well as anybody. It's ensuring that MWBs are paid on time, especially from the prime contractors, is just critical, because these companies, the majority of the time, are not big companies. They can't have 60, 90-day floats, and that's can be fast sometimes for invoice processing. And I think it's really crucial, and it's a kind of a tough position for the city to be in, because the city doesn't want to have any privity with subcontractors, which a lot of MWBs are subcontractors, but the city doesn't have any kind of look into the terms and conditions that are going into the contracts between the prime and the subcontractors. And so MWBs really, I think they need some help in that area, and I think that they're getting raked over the coals in a lot of instances by the prime contractors in these subcontracts, and so I honestly don't know what could be done about that, and I don't think you're going to see any help from the city because of legal reasons. But maybe there's something that could be done in that area to help MWBEs in their contract negotiations with the primes when they're entering into subcontract relationships with them.
I should just also note, because some people may not be familiar with what MWBE stands for. It stands for Minority Women Business Enterprises, and there's been a very focused policy effort, and rightfully so, by the city and the state to ensure that a percentage of contracts go to MWBE companies to support their continued growth. Thank you for that. There's a question. Let's see, some questions popping up here. What city department is responsible for? I think that might be asylum issues. Is it the Department of Human Services?
That feels like me.
I don't know.
So there's all human services, right? I would say so. It's really cutting across agencies. So the two deputy mayors, Sheena Wright, who's the deputy mayor for strategic initiatives, and Ann Williams Isom, who's the deputy mayor for human services, health and human services, have really taken the lead there, because it's really comprehensive, right? Like, the needs of the asylum seekers are complex, and it's going to be an all hands on deck situation. So there's obviously DSS, which is the Department of Social Services, which does homeless services and housing, is obviously taking the lead in terms of welcoming people off of the buses and making sure they have somewhere to sleep. But then that goes, that's all nonprofit human service providers who are doing the next steps. And then there's obviously, food, they need clothing, they're going to need job training. There's immigration legal services to get them the asylum status that they need. So it's really comprehensive, and it cuts across pretty much every program area in the nonprofit human services area. Thank you.
And what a dichotomy in governmental leadership, right? On the one hand, you have states saying, get out of here, and we're going to use you as political pawns, and we're going to send them to states. And then on the other hand, you have a real welcoming environment that cares for people that are facing, really complicated, complex troubles, and trying to help, and has that's the beauty of New York City. Like, we have this social service net that welcomes people and offers their help and shows care. And, it's why among the many reasons why this city, not to bring in the term of the webinar, but the future of the city is bright. I mean, you have people who are incredibly talented, incredibly gifted, that just want to be a take care of their families, and they're willing to contribute to society and the economy in every way.
Mhm.
And here we are doing the best we can in this extraordinary public-private partnership to support them, versus the other side where it's just disgraceful. Anyway, that's a whole other topic that's just gonna get me angry,
Ditto,
and
though.
you're gonna see
Very
me
important, I think.
get very red. Another quick question: are there, other innovative approaches that you've seen in terms of responding to RFPs and other procurement opportunities that would be good for our audience to know? Things that have been, unique or thought-provoking, things of that nature? Who wants to start?
I was going to give Adam a chance to go first.
I think we've touched on a lot of this today. I believe Controller Lander just put out a report in conjunction with the task force that was shared with us recently. And I will, if I'm not citing this properly, please forgive me. But I really like one of the ideas out there for automatic renewals and extensions on contracts where a procurement action hasn't been initiated or has been held up for some reason. I thought that was really a good idea. Especially if there are no responsibility issues with the existing vendor, like just, having a legal framework in place for the work that's being done is so important. And for so much of this work to be done at risk is just, it's not a good way to operate. So I think that would be a great idea. It would at least give a little comfort to the lawyers in the building, and forever how much anybody cares about that, I can understand. But I thought that was a really great idea. Another thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately is, there's a pretty complex process for vendors to apply for prompt payment interest when the city is late in making payments. And I'm wondering if there's any reason that couldn't be just I'm wondering if there's any reasons that couldn't be automated or be included, or, hopefully this is something that can be worked into Passport. This would probably take some restructuring of the way the city does invoicing and processes invoicing. And, but, again, it's just, I didn't see too many people take advantage of it. And again, it's like, if you're going to float the city and work at risk, it shouldn't be on a no interest basis, and you shouldn't have to jump through 9,000 hoops to get a little return on that. I would think. I think those two would be pretty good.
Yeah, I think the joint task force report, which is the controller and the mayor, when they were just elected, put together this kind of clear what has now become the Clear the Backlog initiative. But they put together a joint task force, which, given our last administration, was certainly just knowing that the controller and the mayor were going to work together to kind of tackle these issues. I think that in of itself is really innovative. And what I really appreciated about that report was they were really honest in what issues they had to tackle. And that's a huge amount of accountability, right? If you admit that there's a problem, you admit that you have to be part of the solution. And so I think I'm really appreciative of both the mayor and the controller for even putting that together and signaling that it was going to be such a cornerstone of the work that they were doing. And Adam, I totally agree with you. I think that we do a lot of responsibility determinations, and it's a lot of paper going back and forth when really the proof is in, the audit and the work that's being done each year. And so there's a lot of things like, automatic renewals, like basically providers re-sign an entire contract every year when they've also signed a contract that's going to last for 5 to 7 years. So I think just the task force itself and the recommendations that they put out and the work that they're doing towards it is really not just a breath of fresh air, but I think they're very innovative.
We're running low on time, and I did want to ask this sort of one question. We've covered a lot about, like, if there's a procurement out there, what is the best way to respond and maximize your likelihood of success? What is do you have advice on, if I have a concept or a business and I want to actually sell into city or into government, what is the right approach to kind of initiate a procurement or sell something? Or not just a product, but like, I have a new way of providing a human service or things of that nature that might not fit into other existing RFPs.
Yeah, I mean, you need to reach out. you need to reach out to the agency, to the agency who would be responsible for procuring that innovative product or service. And you need to make yourself heard, and you need to say, hey, I recognize that there's a need for this out in the community, and explain. You need to. I mean, it's it seems obvious, but it's like you need to sell it, and so you need to make a connection within the agency, and whether that's showing up for some agency event, or contacting the commissioner, or reaching out to one of the deputy commissioners or whatever. Again, the city is so big and it buys so many different things. A lot of times it doesn't really, and the city does such an excellent job at meeting the needs of its citizens, but it can't meet the needs of every single citizen. So you got to go in there and make the case you got to go in there and make the case for yourself that the city needs to buy this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in the human service area, it has become difficult to kind of insert that. I think that there is offices of innovation and smaller offices in the city that you can kind of interject some of that. And I think, so I don't have a lot of good advice in that area, to be honest, because I think we've become a little prescriptive in human services, but also we have a new administration, and there's going to be things like when we think of the de Blasio administration, he created the children's cabinet, he did the pre-K initiative. So whenever there's a new administration, there's opportunity to influence in terms of, what are the program areas that the city's picking up, and ideally, like in the concept paper stage, there's an opportunity to demonstrate through your own, program that you want to now have become city funded or something like that, to at least show your work and hope that, you can kind of have a seat at the table or inject your research and business model into that process. But it's certainly an uphill battle.
Yeah, I just would add, I think that a lot of times people get the sense that, well, if they try and reach out to the government, or they send a letter, or they send an email, they make a phone call, nobody on the other end cares. And I can tell you from personal experience that feedback from the community and from the citizens of New York is taken very seriously by New York City government. And so you just got to make yourself heard. And you got to show up. You got to show up to hearings. You got to reach out to your elected officials. You got to reach out to the agencies. The government's there to serve the people. And in a lot of cases, the people that are reaching out are also New York City taxpayers, and they're New York City based businesses. And and they vote. And so, you gotta be active, I think is the key.
Absolutely. And what a nice way to end is, so it's advocacy, which is our bread and butter, right? Which is, government does hear you. They have to log every phone call and every email that you send them. And so being a tireless advocate and involving your community and what you want to see change is absolutely a foundation of who New York is and how this works.
That is very true. There's almost 9 million people and probably 9 million different opinions, which is why we love it here. On that note, sadly, we are out of time. I'm sure we can continue this conversation for hours, and hope to do so. Adam, Michelle, I mean, that was fantastic. Thank you for all of your insights and suggestions today. I hope our audience had an opportunity to learn something. I hope that this is information that you can take back to your various organizations and utilize it to either respond to RFPs or advocate, as Michelle said, for new things. And I, hope that, if there's usually some government officials on, that there's some nuggets of information here that could just, we want to be helpful. We all just want to be helpful in making this work, and commend you for a lot of the work that you're doing. And, always good to look at ways to make it better. If I could just end on the note of the importance of stressing to learn more about the Human Services Council. They do phenomenal work. They're making thousands, if not millions, of people in our city's life better. And I think the onus is on all of us to help support, to continue to allow Michelle and her team and all of their members to continue to improve the lives of many New Yorkers. Thank you so much. Please be on the lookout for other Future of New York opportunities. I hope to see you there. And Adam and Michelle, thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And your support of the Human Services Council.
Of course.
Thanks, Travis. Thanks, Michelle.
All right. Everyone be well. Take care.